Romans were an inspirational society who created the basis of the English language as well as many other great inventions such as aqueducts and carts. I'm sure you've heard of great heroic stories about great Romans like Julius Caesar. But what happened after these great inventors and heroes died? Where did they go? What happens when a Roman dies? Like in today's world, Romans held funerals for their deceased relatives. These funerals were an essential part of Roman life. Roman funerals were held in high standards. A Roman funeral was a rite of passage to the underworld for any person. They symbolized the transition between life and death. It was believed that a proper burial was essential for the passage to the afterlife. It was important that a funeral was to be done properly in order to prevent the wandering of spirits. If a body was not buried at all, or buried improperly, the spirit would lurk around the town and never reach the underworld. To prevent upsetting these spirits, Romans took a systematic approach when tending to the dead.
Once a Roman died, the body must be prepared for the funeral. To start, the corpse was bathed and perfumed by funeral societies called collegia. The body was then dressed in the richest robes and laid upon a couch of flowers, with the feet pointing towards the outer doors or placed in the tomb that the Romans themselves built during their lifetime. Finally, the most important step of preparing the corpse was performed. The professional undertakers, called the libitinari, would place coins under the tongue or over the eyes. These coins were to be paid to Charon, who ferried and ensured a safe journey to the underworld. Once all steps were completed, the body was ready for the burial process.
A Roman funeral took place in 5 different parts. The first part of a Roman funeral was procession. Procession was the movement of the dead body and its followers to the funeral site. This parade of people started with hired musicians, followed by mourners and relatives who often carried portrait sculptures or wax masks of other deceased family members. The musicians started by playing Roman tunes appropriate for a funeral. The mourners followed by uttering loud lamentations. Professional mourners, normally women who were paid to be there, wailed loudly while ripping out hair, beating their breasts, and scratching and tearing at their face and cheeks. After the mourners came actors and mimes. The actors dressed up as ancestors of the dead person by wearing masks. The body was moved after the actors passed. People carried the body in a bier or tomb. Family brought up the end of procession. Relatives would close their eyes while calling out the name of their dearly departed. The procession would end outside of the town because it was forbidden to burn or bury anyone within the city limits, so that the priests may not be contaminated by touching a dead body, and so that houses would not be endangered by funeral fires.
The second part of a Roman funeral was the cremation or burial, which was typically held at night to prevent public gatherings and to discourage crowds. Cremation was more of a common practice among the rich because of the expensive cost. When the procession finished outside of a city, a pyre or cremation fire was built. The body was then put onto the funeral pyre, where it burned into ashes until the fire was extinguished. After the pyre was extinguished, a family member, usually the wife or mother of the deceased, would gather the ashes and place them into an urn. Romans believed the body did not enter the underworld until the ashes were placed into the urn. The impression was that the deceased was still roaming about during the funeral until all was finished.
The third part of a Roman funeral was the eulogy. This is a speech or piece of writing that praises someone or something highly, typically someone who has just died. In some situations, a eulogy was only offered if the deceased was important or made an impact on the society. Otherwise, most funerals included a eulogy. As the fire burned, the eulogy was given in honor of the deceased.
The fourth part of the burial process was a feast. The meal occurred at the end of the burial or cremation. This meal was used to tell the deceased that they could move to the underworld and the family could carry on with life. Eventually, 9 days after the disposal of the body, another feast was given. This feast was called the Cena Novendialis. Afterwards, the family would have a libation poured over the grave or ashes.
The last phase of the Roman burial process was the commemoration. This was a certain day set aside for remembrance of the deceased. Several Roman holidays commemorated a family's dead ancestors. The Parentalia honored the family's ancestors from February 13th through the 21st. The Lemuria, held on May 9th, 11th, and 13th, was almost the opposite. During this time, Roman ghosts were feared to be active. This meant the paterfamilias sought to appease them.
An important factor to the Roman funerals was social status. Funerals differed from the wealthy to the poor. A poor person typically had a burial funeral. Once a poor person died, their body was often buried after only one day, leaving minimal time for mourning. Their corpse was buried with a lack of ceremony, and the sacrifice would be made to the family instead of a god. If a family did not have any money to afford the proper burial, they would put the corpse in a basket and throw it into a creek where other poor dead people had been thrown. Children less than 40 days old and slaves had familiar funerals. The rich had much nicer funerals since they had more money to spend. Most rich people have their deceased cremated. Upper-class individuals were often put on display for as long as a week, offering many opportunities for many mourners to pay their final respects. Excessive mourning, which in the case of major political figures could often lead to serious unrest. The tombs of the rich were usually constructed of marble, the ground enclosed with walls, and planted round with trees. Wealthy people had their bodies carried in a procession to the Forum, the main square of the city. Their body laid on a central platform called the rostra, or the coffin stood up for all to see. An even bigger funeral was called for the death of the emperor. The emperor was buried inside of the city. This honor was reserved for only the most exceptional and illustrious people. Emperors who died believed to become gods through apotheosis. After the death, much more impressive and more expensive monuments were erected.
Whether rich or poor, buried or cremated, all Romans cherished the idea of a funeral. To them, a funeral was the final hurrah about their lives and a chance to get to the underworld. Now, when you think about Rome, think about the heroes and their success, as well as their death and funeral.